Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Paideia Today. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and joined as always by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we have a most curious selection in front of us. We have Beckett's Waiting for Godot, oftentimes named as one of the most significant plays, if not the most significant play, of the second half of the 20th century. And certainly the play stands for or operates as something of a flagship for many of the key intellectual ideas and artistic ideas of postmodernism. And Dr. Masson and I are going to begin with a short reading here. Dr. Masson is going to take on the role of Vladimir, and I shall take on the role of Estragon. Anytime you're ready, Dr. Masson.
Yeah, imagine us wearing top hats, because I guess that's what we would have worn, or bowler hats, right?
Yeah, but shabby ones, very shabby ones.
Abbott and or Laurel and Hardy style. Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
Let's wait and see what he says.
Who?
Godot.
Good idea.
Let's wait till we know exactly how we stand.
On the other hand, it might be better to strike the iron before it freezes.
I'm curious to hear what he has to offer. Then we'll take it or leave it.
What exactly did we ask him for?
Were you not there?
I can't have been listening.
Oh, nothing very definite.
A kind of a prayer.
Precisely.
A vague supplication.
Exactly.
And what did he reply?
That he'd see.
That he couldn't promise anything.
That he'd have to think it over.
In the quiet of his home.
Consult his family.
His friends.
His agents.
His correspondence.
His books.
His bank account.
Before taking a decision.
It's the normal thing.
Is it not?
I think it is.
I think so too.
And we?
I beg your pardon?
I said, and we?
I don't understand.
Where do we come in?
Come in?
Take your time.
Come in? On our hands and knees?
As bad as that?
Your worship wishes to assert his prerogatives?
We've no rights anymore.
You'd make me laugh if it wasn't prohibited.
We lost our rights?
We got rid of them.
And so it goes back and forth through two lengthy acts. And what Dr. Masson and I were doing there, by the way, the dramatic name for that rapid one-line back and forth is stickomythia, just in case you're wondering.
Yeah.
And it's something that the ancient Greeks would oftentimes use for comedic effect.
Yes.
Now, for anybody who's actually seen the play, they might have been baffled by what they saw up on the stage. And anytime I mentioned the play Waiting for Godot, especially because it's one of the most important plays in the 20th century, they'll ask me what it's about. And I have to usually respond with nothing. It's about nothing. It belongs to a particular type of theater, which came into being somewhere in the late 40s, early 1950s, called the theater of the absurd. And the theater of the absurd is, well, it's a response to many things. It's a response to many of the things Dr. Masson and I have been talking about, which have gone on before. So we start with the symbolists, we move into the aesthetes. What we haven't talked about here, at least in any length, is the rise of Dadaism and Surrealism in the earlier parts of the 20th century. This Dadaism in particular exerted an initial influence on T.S. Eliot, but in time he stepped away from it and into other things. And so what exactly is theater of the absurd? Well, theater of the absurd is a reaction to the vast violence and absurdity of the 20th century. We have two world wars, not just one, and people were writing back into it. And what does it all mean? What was the significance of what we have undergone? And typically the theater of the absurd highlights alienation, which of course is a hallmark of the 20th century, the isolation of the individual, the cruelty of life, the futility of ambition tends to be highly surrealistic, tends to be illogical, irrational. It rejects truth value. Indeed, it rejects value full stop. On the other hand, it tends to be relatively metaphysical. It begs philosophical questions, and this, of course, aligns quite nicely with the thinking of Beckett and his circle, particularly in Paris. Beckett was heavily influenced initially by James Joyce, but at a certain point in his life, I think it was 1945, he was in Paris with the resistance. Actually, no, he wasn't in Paris. He had to flee Paris 2 years earlier. And he realized that James Joyce had essentially done everything worth doing in terms of the key concepts of the 20th century around the novel. So Beckett decided to take his art in different directions. And his greatest and most memorable product is, of course, this play. When the play came out, it was initially written in French and then it was translated into English. As you might imagine, it baffled people because, quite frankly, the two characters here, Vladimir and Estragon, they're waiting for a figure called Godot, and Godot never arrives. The play focuses centrally on what doesn't happen, on anticlimax, on intense irony, and of course, sometimes the comedy that comes out of here. There are funny moments in Waiting for Godot, to be sure. It's also a very witty play in many ways, but it's witty about nothing in particular. The critics, when they first saw it, were, like I said, completely baffled for the most part. But then along came the Irish theater critic Vivian Mercer, who said, when they asked him what the play was about, he said, essentially what I said, he said, nothing happens twice, 2 acts. There are 2 acts in Waiting for Godot. And then he went on to say, and you'll have to excuse my language a little bit here, the play is, quote, a way to piss away 2 hours in the dark with a bunch of strangers without getting bored. You know, like life, end quote. So he saw the play as, in some senses, being highly realistic, even as it was surrealistic, because it kind of caught the spirit, the zeitgeist of man in the 1950s, in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the Holocaust, and now grappling with the Cold War and the absurdities and the potential for global annihilation via nuclear war. Life was patently absurd, and the theater of the absurd really caught the spirit of that moment. The play also functioned very much as an inspiration to many other playwrights who have come since. Tom Stoppard is a notable playwright who saw this as a key play, influencing his development as a playwright. And if you've actually seen any of the plays by Stoppard, you will see immediate and striking similarities in certain respects with Waiting for Godot. It also is the blended product of a lot of thinkers and their ideas at the time. So, for instance, Theodor Adorno, the great aesthetics philosopher, he had said that the play made manifest in art what everyone who was anyone in the Western intellectual tradition had come to suspect, that value, meaning, truth, and philosophy were dead concepts. We were better off if we just shed them and move ahead with what we had inherited from that, which is, to some extent, a lot of nothing. And this brings up another word that gets attached to Waiting for Godot and Theater of the Absurd, which is nihilistic. The play is nihilistic. It celebrates the big dark nothing that is life in the wake of all of this. So I understand, Dr. Masson, that it's been a long, long time since you've actually seen the play. And you saw it back in England, I believe, if I'm recalling correctly here.
That's correct. Yeah, I've seen it a couple of times, actually, both in England. I think I saw it in Canada once as well. It's not the sort of play one needs to see more than once, because it's much ado about nothing, as you said. But if you see it as a reflection of the times, as you say, the Zeitgeist, and a reflection of the philosophical themes of the age, it starts to make a great deal more sense. One of the really famous writers of the period, you mentioned that Beckett, although he was Irish, lived in Paris and wrote in French and English, wrote this first in French and translated it into English. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a book called L'être et le néant, which is being and nothingness. And that is really, to my mind, sort of central to this whole enterprise. It's really about nothing. but the significance of nothing, which to some degree is nothing. There is no significance. You can't signify nothing. I mean, it's actually a philosophical question what
Hmm.
the number zero represents, and it's actually not nothing. You can find some really interesting philosophical discussions of that topic. But in Waiting for Godot, I think we can see some really different types of expression. You mentioned the theater of the absurd. So if I were to teach this, and here's how I would come at it, and sometimes hot takes are good, sometimes they're not. I guess we're going to find out here. I mentioned Much Ado About Nothing. That's a Shakespearean play. It's a comic play as well, very much witty as well, very full of wit and interaction between male and female characters. Shakespeare's plays have a beginning, a middle, and an end. As a comedy, they end with marriage. There's a great deal of conflict. There's a great deal of humor. There's also some profound meditations, although they're often taken as asides because comedy is not a great genre when it's at least in terms of a domestic comedy. It doesn't really fit it very well. This is more of a philosophical type of engagement. But my point about the beginning, the middle, and the end is this doesn't have one. It's 2 acts, and it finishes where it starts. It begins, and so a critic might say it as a circular plot structure. So it doesn't go from here and end here. It doesn't move anywhere. It stays in the same spot. It revolves. It goes around the same point. And on that note, there's another writer, same period. I'm trying to think of the name. The Myth of Sisyphus. It's oh gosh, what's the name of the writer? Camus. Another nihilist, right? And another existentialist. And Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus, which fits this in some ways, is of a giant punished for transgressing against the gods, and he was punished by having to roll a huge boulder up a hill only to have it come back down upon him. To some degree, that's what's happening here. It's a repetition of the same things over and over without any apparent significance. I'm teaching Shakespeare right now a line from Macbeth that Macbeth himself says when his wife dies. He says that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's what he says in his existential despair at the after he has given up hope of salvation because he threw it away willingly, knowingly of the moral consequences. This play does talk about those similar sorts of themes. It might be interesting to compare it to that, but it's not courting comparison to plays like that. I mean, it comes in the 20th century, but it's in a sense, it's the end of the great tradition. It's not trying to engage with the past. There's no significance to the past, although we could see the 2 characters as reflecting on the 2 thieves crucified alongside Christ. They do actually refer to that. Do you teach about that, Bill? Do you say anything about that? I've read over the years, as I say, it's in the remote past, that some think this is a Christian play even. What are your thoughts on that?
I would see that as a very difficult case to make for a number of reasons. You're right. Things here don't happen with a beginning, middle, and end. There's no triplicities. There's nothing like that going on here. And as you say, they end where they begin. Notice that we've got pairing absolutely everywhere in here, and that if there is meaning, it is a relative individual construct by comparing one thing to another thing, and that's the only way that meaning arises. Meaning arises not from one thing, not from the other thing, but from the comparison of in between the 2 things, the intangible thing. One thing is its thing only in comparison to another thing. Notice except for the boy, everybody shows up in pairs as well. So you got 2 acts. You got Vladimir and Estragon, you got Pozzo and Lucky, you got the pairing and the pairing and the pairing, and it goes on and on like that. And I think that's absolutely necessary to this because it operates largely within the dynamics of binary opposition and a critique of what would become called logocentrism. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit, exactly what that is. But before I get there, you're right. This play, in some senses, is not a coherent response to a great tradition, theatrical or otherwise. This is a play written, quote, at the end of history. History and its meaning and its telos, its ideology, have come grumbling to a halt. And I think I said this in regards to T.S. Eliot. As the modernists, some people call Samuel Beckett, by the way, some people call him the last of the great modernists. I consider him the first of the great postmodernists. And I'll talk about that in just a minute.
Yeah.
But remember I said of the modernists that the modernists violently challenge and reject tradition, and along with tradition, history, tied up with that. They attempted to violate it. They attempted to overturn the progress of history. They attempted to look at history and telos in new ways. W.B. Yeats said history is actually more like a giant corkscrew. It's cyclical, but it moves forward at the same time. He was drawing off of Wilhelm Dilthey at that point, I think. So they're challenging history, and they're trying to see history anew, and they're angry at history. Whereas the postmodernists don't even really have anything in mind to challenge anymore. They've wiped out history. They know that history is kind of a generic concept, has brought badness to them. It ended with Cold Wars and Holocausts and World Wars and stuff like this. But they haven't bothered studying it, and certainly not its art in great detail. I hear the postmodernists quote the great thinkers of the past incorrectly all the time. Derrida drives me up the wall with this. Foucault drives me up the wall with this. Sartre drives me up the wall with this. They'll tell me about Plato, how Plato asserted this thing, and I've actually read Plato, and I know that he asserted something different or something exactly the opposite.
Yes.
Or he says, Augustine, on the other hand, says this thing over here, and I'm thinking to myself, no, he doesn't.
He never says that.
I know what you're talking about. He says the opposite of that.
Yes.
They don't really know their history. And notice that here's to me an interesting corollary. Notice that both Vladimir and Estragon, and to some extent Pozzo and Lucky, they're all amnesiacs. They don't remember how they got here. They don't know. They don't know their own history. Remember what T.S. Eliot said about memory and desire. Your memory informs your desire. Your memory of the past informs your desire for the future. That's how it works. So you want to have a strong, replete, rich, and nuanced sense of causational history so that you can make informed decisions, so that you desire informed things to be your objectives in the future going forward. These people don't have a history. These people don't have a memory in any sort of significant sense. They are amnesiacs. Who knows what drives them? What does drive them, if not their memory, if not their history? And it's a very good philosophical question. So the play does a good job actually of teasing that question out. If you don't know how you got here, how can you know where to go?
Yes.
So we have that in front of us. Let me come back and talk a little bit about binary opposition.
Let me push back on this a little bit and get your thoughts, because I can see where you're heading, and I can see that I'm probably going to agree with you as well, because this sort of binary opposition is part of the structuralist linguistics of the 20th century, which really dominates the I think most of certainly French philosophy and thinking, and even you could say to some degree gets into Heidegger and continental philosophy very deeply. But there are scriptural allusions in the play, and I say allusion because it at least points to it. But does it signify anything will be the question. But the allusion, so in the boy at the outset that you mentions that he and his brother mine Godot's sheep and goats. So the reference there to the two, those who have been saved and those who have been predestined to be damned, more or less. The idea of the two thieves I mentioned already. There's a tree in the play on the stage. Some say that it could either be a reference to the cross or maybe the tree of life. Some see God and Godot as at least alluded to one another. There's some sort of reference there. Vladimir calls out, Christ have mercy upon us. You could conceivably at least imagine that he's making some sort of profession of belief, or is he? What are your thoughts on this, Bill? Because
Well,
these are at least potentially, you could see why somebody might want to read this as a Christian play.
yeah, there are some references in there. I tend to see them very much in the spirit that same spirit that I read W.B. Yeats' Christian allusions. These are allusions which are artistically and perhaps historically significant to the artist in question, but they're only significant because they're part of that tradition or history insofar as he understands it. Are they a living, breathing concern to the man himself? No, the man, Samuel Beckett would tell anybody who would listen that he was a militant agnostic, and he insisted this really informed his the production of his art. He was also asked by one of the more significant early actors whether or not Godot was God, and Beckett told him point blank, no, he was not.
No.
Which is a curious thing to assert with a play that has opened up and licenses relativistic interpretations, indeed is almost built to do so, custom built. The tree, on the other hand, seems to have these indirect allusions, and you can make the connections with the cross on Golgotha, or the tree of life, if you like. It's supposed to be a barren tree in the first act, and then there are a few leaves on it in the second.
And we're told it's a willow.
Yes, it's a weeping willow or something like this.
Which has allusions of tragedy and, obviously weeping.
Yes, of course. It's also the tree on which they, at the end of the second act, they say, well, they're going to commit suicide, so they're going to hang themselves.
Yeah.
But they've managed to forget the ropes, so apathy sets in, and they can't even be bothered to get that right.
Yeah, they can't even get to take themselves out.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And Beckett says that Christianity is a mythology with which I'm perfectly familiar, so I naturally use it. So that I think, again, with your little input there, that he explicitly says that Godot is not God and refers to Christianity as a mythology that he uses, that more or less satisfies any question of whether this is a Christian play. It's Christian as far as he knows something about it, but there's no profession there. And thematically, I can't really see it either. Again, the whole trajectory of the play suggests that there's no meaning or purpose to what we've just seen. That's, I would have thought, the antithesis to what a Christian play would do.
Yeah. Beckett saw the lack of meaning, the lack of substance, the lack of things to be the proper the proper sort of mediums or topics for his output, his work, his poetry, his novels, his plays, and stuff like this. And this is why I always mention binary opposition and logocentrism, because it helps my students begin to make sense of how Beckett is operating. And I think that's a much more useful way to approach this play, not in terms of why does he say what he says, or even what exactly is he saying, but rather how is he trying to say it, because that's where the machinery becomes a little bit more coherent and complex.
Okay, so let me stop you,
sure,
because I know what you're talking about here, but I'm not sure we've got into logocentrism at all. And I think you need to say a little bit about that here.
Yeah. So first of all, let's clear up binary opposition. Binary opposition is a notion. You'll encounter it in psychology, anthropology, sociology, a number of other places, which insists that one thing only has coherence or meaning in direct relationship to another thing, often its opposite. So love is meaningful only against a backdrop of hate. Light is lightness only against a backdrop of darkness. Swiftness is swiftness only compared to slowness. The list goes on.
Yeah, but there are more important ones, like evil defines the good, or nothingness defines being. Those become more consequential, right?
Right. Now, in the postmodernist period in the 1950s, quite a number of postmodern thinkers, you've mentioned some already, so have I. Sartre, who actually was a personal acquaintance of Beckett, Foucault, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Simone de Beauvoir, Camus. Who else do I have on my list here? Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, the artist.
Yeah.
All these people are moving literally in the same circles and influencing each other. And one of the things they wanted to challenge was this notion of logocentrism. Logocentrism, they said, is sort of a reason-heavy, patriarchy-heavy way of conceiving the world, and it privileges one element of the binary opposition over the other element. So I've got my standard
So
list here.
being over nothingness, for instance.
Yeah, speech is privileged over writing. By the way, this is where we get our language of privileging and stuff.
Or silence. And this play begins and ends in silence. So that's
Yes.
significant as well, right? Yeah.
So logocentric thinkers, we also valorize presence over absence, identity over difference, fullness over emptiness, meaning over meaninglessness, mastery over submission, and life over death. It's a standard list.
Male over female. You got it.
Yes. So the things I'm listing first there are also associated with the masculine, and the other things are oftentimes associated with the feminine.
Yeah.
Now, what a lot of these thinkers, including Beckett, wanted to do is they wanted to explore the underprivileged side of various interwoven binary opposites. So they began exploring writing over speech, absence over presence, difference was suddenly more important than identity, emptiness is more important in a play like this than fullness, meaninglessness, submission, and death. These are all things that these become now
the slave over the master there in the play as well, right?
Yeah. Yes, very much. Pozzo and Lucky. Lucky is the servant and or slave of Pozzo in both acts. Though Pozzo has gone blind and Lucky is mute in the second act. So misfortune has befallen him. There's a lot of suffering in this play.
Yes.
And so the laughter is oftentimes awkward laughter, because you're not quite sure if you should be laughing at this. But then, of course, by way of extension, you could argue that all comedy at some remove is violence and suffering. So in any event, if you start looking at all these pairs and these pairs of motifs in the play, within the dynamics of logocentrism and its privileging or deprivileging, as it happens in this play, a lot of things begin to not make more sense, but you can see how they're functioning. You can see how they're trying to communicate one relative to the other. I think at the end of the day, the task remains futile, even using this machinery, but nevertheless, it is the machinery by which this play largely operates, in my view. Now,
I think with your explanation of the binary oppositions, it's particularly helpful. And this play, I think, without that understanding, doesn't make any sense. And so the sense only of the play only comes in terms of opposition, and opposition to something that is really quite crassly defined in terms of, like, there are no shades of gray per se. There's a black and there's a white. There's a male and a female, a being and a nothing. But note that the male and female are not both human beings, that one will have being, the other won't. So there's a very much of a radical politics that I think is a part of this as well, and really a destructive form of understanding the world as well. But it's not just, I'm talking about the implications of it. I don't think that Beckett would necessarily have dissented from that view that it's bleak. I mean, you called it the theater of the absurd, or rather it is called the theater of the absurd, and that's probably why there is a sense of meaningless of life. So I mentioned Macbeth making that assertion about the meaning of life after his wife had lost her life or taken her life. She'd hanged herself, and he speaks in that moment in character. But here the characters speak that way the entire time, from the beginning of the play to the end. There's no movement. This is the human condition. So I find it rather tedious, but if you think that it reflects the basic nature of reality as we signify it, and as you mentioned, in both the psychology and the linguistics, we have the play of signifiers, one sign referring to another sign, deriving its meaning from that other sign. So black only means something in contradistinction to the white, or the being to the nothing. Note that evil is also thereby dependent on the good and vice versa. And so you get a sort of a dualism that emerges that I think is deeply problematic, but also will characterize what we see in what you, I think, rightly called postmodern literature at this point, because now we have moved into a full-blown departure from modernism as we defined it earlier. You said that though, so why don't I let you make the case here?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, in some senses, postmodernism is basically the follow through of a lot of things that got underway in modernism. I mentioned how Dadaism was a notion that became quite popular in the teens and then in the 20s, primarily in continental Europe, which explored the fundamental lack or illegitimacy of logic, reason, purpose, etc., etc., etc. And that was a response to the apocalypse of World War I. And so this is an idea that gets underway, and they begin critiquing the authority of reason and critiquing the limits of logic and meaning and purpose and value and all these sorts of things. But they don't outright reject them. They critique them. Some of them reject, but for the most part, they wouldn't reject them entirely. They're challenging, just as they challenge history and tradition, so they challenge these fundamental concepts of Western culture as conceived in Western culture compared to other cultures. You'll notice that at this time as well, amongst the modernists, there are a select bunch that begin casting their eyes further abroad into other cultures and how they actually build and perpetuate meaning and purpose and truth and all these sorts of things. Yes. So for instance, Ezra Pound becomes quite obsessed with all things Japanese, and he begins writing haiku, and he destroyed understandings of haiku for many young people for decades thereafter, because he just basically remade it in his own image. But this is kind of a common thing. But then these things get followed through and get taken to their completed state by the postmodernists. History is no longer critiqued. It's dispensed with, it's rejected, it's rewritten as needs may require it. The way in which history, for instance, is taught now in a modern high school tends not to be in a causational sequence. It tends to be taught in splinters and bits, because we no longer believe in the logic of historical causality or ideology or telos or whatever it is you want to call it. Yeah, we've rejected that, and so our students only get a million little shattered bits of the great stained window of history. Likewise with logic and reason. Remember, this is logocentrism, the logos here, and they don't like this, so they're rejecting the meaning, the reason that is communicated by the logos in all its varied senses across history. So reason is dispensed with, and all of a sudden you have something which is absurd, and even though it's absurd, it's every bit as valid as that which doesn't seem to be absurd. So each are valued equally when it comes to artistic production and things of this sort. You also mentioned Ferdinand Saussure's notion of sign and signified, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Saussure was a turn of the century, what do we want to call him? He was a linguist, but he primarily concentrated on zoological things in terms of significance and meaning making and language and stuff like this. And he came up with this notion that words, and indeed the ideas that precede the word in its utterance or in writing it down, are signifiers which attach according to some sort of social convention to a type of thing out there. I make the noise chair, and this, we both agree, means the things you and I are sitting in right now. So that sound is the signifier, and our chairs are the signified. Now here's the postmodernist turn. They insist that the signs, that the reality that the signs communicate are arbitrarily attaching to the world around us and to the world within. And it's the arbitrariness of the connection that they really want to underscore. So if you cut the chain of the anchor chain, if you will, of language from reality, it can represent in any way you want. Your autonomy when it comes to language is supreme, because all language at the end of the day doesn't really signify much of anything. It's just noise. And they're continuously at pains to emphasize the arbitrary relationship of words to things, to beings, to concepts, things of this nature. By the way, Saussure, again, I don't know if he was doing it deliberately or not, seems to be ripping off Augustine in a big way,
Yeah.
because Augustine talks extensively about signs and signifiers in On Christian Doctrine. But again, this is just, I encounter this all the time with postmodern thinkers and artists. I don't think Saussure mentions anywhere an indebtedness to Augustine. He just basically presents it as his own idea, and everyone says that's brilliant because nobody's read their Augustine, and they think that Saussure's come up with this ex nihilo.
Yes, no, very good. And I mean, we're right in my wheelhouse here. So I just finished teaching De Doctrina, and that discussion of signs and things, signa and res, is right at the front
Yep.
of that work. And we talked about it in Paideia today, I think, early on. I don't know if it was season 2, I think it was. And there, a res, a thing that is signified by the sign, is something that we can conceptualize. It's a thought, but the thought adheres to something. There's something there. Now, for Augustine, the thing is a what later on gets called a transcendental signified, namely God, which is not a thing in the sense of an object, but a thing in the think of something that can be conceived, something thought of. Thoughts seem to disappear in this period. Words replace thoughts. And funnily enough, once you get rid of anything rational or things that can be thought, then of course words referring to other words signify nothing. My doctoral thesis was actually on silence and the crisis of self-legitimation in English Romanticism. That was the title. And my argument, yeah, what a title, eh? It's a if you want something to go to sleep with at night, that'll do it for you. Can you imagine the jibes for my doctorate? You're writing on silence. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, I would imagine they would love the irony.
It was great. Yes, and I have to write 100,000 words on it at that, and they signify nothing. Believe me.
That was going through my head.
Yeah, of course it was. I had to beat you to the punch there. But they. What I argued is that the beginning of this, I didn't talk about the postmodern writers like Beckett and company, but it was obvious where this came from. The silence in the Romantic period, the references there, and the use of language, and the detachment from the tradition, and the reconceptualizing of the imagination, creating things ex nihilo out of the artist's head. These are the beginnings of this movement, and I see what comes after as a consequence of that movement. And so, what you call, I think rightly, postmodernism begins perhaps in the modernist period as an anti-enlightenment, anti-rational, in some cases anti-theistic movement, and anti-Western, anti-meaning, anti-purpose, and very much centered on feelings as opposed to thoughts.
Yes.
And yeah, that's all there. And you're right, I think, also with Ferdinand de Saussure. The only thing I would say in his defense is that all we have of de Saussure's work is what his students wrote up. He didn't actually even publish this book, the General Course in Structural Linguistics. His students wrote it up. Interestingly, I was told, I put my lecture up online, and I was told by students in India that Saussure got his ideas from acquaintance with Hinduism and their sense of the binary nature of reality. And I thought that was fascinating. I didn't know that, and I have not explored it, but I'm assuming that they have a basis for saying that, and it certainly makes sense.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot was, again, when he was young, as I said, he was quite influenced by Dadaism, and Dadaism draws many of its roots, actually, in terms of concept and what have you, from Eastern thought and Indian thought in particular.
Yeah.
So, I don't think I'm exaggerating the sudden interest by anti-Western Westerners seeking wisdom from other cultures. They become tourists or nomads, if you like, because they don't like where they traditionally lived culturally and artistically and intellectually. So they wander ever further afield. This brings up another point we should mention here.
I'll let you finish it. No, I don't want to interrupt your thought.
Well, it's just really quite a simple thought, which is that here, insofar as Western values and Western traditions and all this stuff is being violently rejected and destroyed, at times gleefully, there is almost a natural gravitational pull for these thinkers over into um, left-wing and oftentimes deep left-wing thought. There was a point where Beckett wanted to go study film in Moscow, and remember, this is in this would be now in the 1930s. This is where we see the worst depredations of Stalin and his NKVD in full swing and operation. And this is where, nevertheless, where Beckett wants to go. To him is some kind of potential utopia. He wants to learn from various film masters over there in Moscow. But you see this amongst many of his circle as well. We've mentioned some already here, the Sartres and the Duchamps and people like this. So this is also part of the rejection. So in the process of rejecting all things Western, they need to find alternatives, unless, but in a few rare cases where they just embrace the nihilism entirely. I think it was Camus who said that the only serious modern question remaining in his age, what we would now call the postmodernist age, is the question of suicide. Every day, that's the only real question, because life is inherently cruel and it's meaningless. Why are you persisting in this mortal veil? And of course, the play actually explores that notion. It comes up. But I want you to finish your thought here as well, because I don't think you were quite done with the arc of your thinking, and I'm hoping I haven't interrupted it too much.
Yeah, I to some degree lost the thread, but maybe it'll come back. I know I wanted to mention Joyce, and you had said that Joyce had done, at least in Beckett's mind, what all that could be done with the novel, so he didn't bother with the novel. Joyce's most famous novel, Ulysses, is really a take on that great epic that we dealt with, I think is the second work we dealt with in Paideia today, the Odyssey. Yep. Ulysses is the Latinized name for Odysseus, and it chronicles characters that are based off of the Odyssey. So Molly, Bloom, and Penelope are alluded to. He has Stephen Dedalus, who's a correspondent to Telemachus and so forth. And a lot of this, as you say, is highly elusive, but obviously is a courting comparison in some manner to that earlier work, in which, again, the meaning of the plot line of it was for the hero Odysseus to come home. That was the point of it. The Ulysses has no such fixed ending per se. Again, it's a sort of a circular plot, and it's written in stream of consciousness as well, which is probably fitting for this use of language. Again, the references are not external or having even a time or purpose or meaning. They're internal thought associations with obviously, as I said, some sort of allusions to classical story, but without any sense of purpose to them, other than to present the purposelessness of Joyce's purpose. And really, that really is what is being pointed out here in this period, is the purposelessness of life. And that's the whole purpose of this. And I know where I was going to go with this. You mentioned that there was it was a leftist tendency, and I think it's fair to say that it is characteristic of the left that there is a sort of a deconstruction product or an anti-Western tendency. But really, it is more, in some ways, it's Gnostic even. It's more than just anti-Western. It is, insofar as it appears more Eastern in its way of thinking, and in its sense of the meaning of history and the sense of its understanding of life, etc. It does seem more Eastern. At the same time, it also seems religious, not in a Christian sense, but in expressing a new Gnosticism. So an antithesis, and it has a certain elitism that goes with Gnosticism. There's the elect and the intellectuals, and they're very much possessing a knowledge which they are claiming that others don't have, and they're trying to oppose the order of things as it currently exists. So there's the sense that this physical world, the references that we might make, are actually ultimately nothing, and they ought to be opposed resolutely across the board. I get that sense. And so some people have asked, how did we get to this current cultural moment where we are in 2021 right now, where things appear to have been utterly destroyed culturally, where there is no history, no sense of history. It's not taught in schools and so forth. I think we can point to this project, which is not a new project, but a long-standing, intellectual, strong, and purposive attempt to remove purpose in the academy.
Yeah, if you've been around these sorts of discussions, which involve a lot of critical theory, literary theory, post-modern existentialist conversations and teaching in classrooms or readings for that matter, the first time you encounter this kind of language, you might be struck by a sense of a kind of dismay at the sheer technical complexity and yet seeming meaninglessness of what is being expressed, what is being said, what is being written. I remember the first time I was started reading Derrida's On Grammatology, I was absolutely flummoxed. What exactly is he saying? And yet it sounds very, very poised and clever, and it's full of jargon. I was just shot through with jargon, and I became very, very frustrated. And then I realized that many of my fellow students who were trying to grapple with the same thing all over the place in all sorts of different disciplines were equally quietly frustrated. They thought that somehow everyone knew this language except for them. So there's this language by which you signal your inclusion gnostically. I like this notion of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism has a secret, sacred language that only the inner circle speaks. And the more you can understand the sacred language, the more you belong. The more and the belonging is almost a spiritual belonging. It's not even an intellectual belonging.
Yes, and associated with Derrida is exactly this anti-logocentrism that you spoke of.
Yeah, and we should also remember that Beckett is vaguely anti-academic and anti-intellectual. He taught briefly at Trinity College in Dublin, and then quit. He wasn't fired, he quit. And in the play here, at a certain point, Pozzo gets lucky to try to entertain Vladimir and Estragon in what can potentially be quite a funny scene. He says, okay, do this, do that, dance for them, etc., etc. And then he tells Lucky to think for entertainment purposes. And so Lucky begins to spout all this babble, intellectual gibberish and what have you. And I've often thought it very striking, of course, because I thought I've been in this experience so many times. I practically live and swim in these waters here of this inner think speak. But I got frustrated to a point where I decided, this was with Derrida. I thought, okay, I'm not bad with languages. I'm going to actually take apart sentence by sentence and phrase by phrase, and I'm going to interpret and translate this into normal English. You can imagine my dismay when I discovered it was much sound and fury signifying nothing. He either didn't say anything, or what he said was just patently and immediately and obviously wrong. And then I did it with another paragraph, and then I wondered, can I take this and translate, do the same sort of thing with Foucault? I could. This too turned out to be largely bankrupt. You get a few sort of key interesting ideas seeded here and there, but everything that welds the rest of them together, no. But it's a Gnostic sort of a noise that they make to signal their inclusion in the inner intellectual and artistic circles. And you can learn to actually write like this and speak like this. There was a consortium of individuals out there who would write patently, deliberately absurd, but heavily technical articles, and they would send them into academic journals to see if they could get them published, knowing full well that they didn't mean anything. And they could get them published all the time. They've since now either identified themselves or they've been exposed. I can't remember what. But it signals the sheer absurdity of our situation. Never mind the theater of the absurd, it's the absurdity overall. But let me finish by saying this. It was a circumstance, the circumstances in which we find ourselves in 2021 were made this way. They didn't just automatically happen like with some sort of Jungian force of history or something like this. People planned this out and decided to take our culture down this road, and they did. And that's something we need to know. This was a thing deliberately done.
Yes.
You also mentioned a couple of other things here I want to get at. You mentioned stream of consciousness. And this is
Yes.
going to turn out to be important for not just postmodernists, but to a lesser extent, modernists themselves. Stream of consciousness thinking was probably most famously popularized by Virginia Woolf,
Yes.
novel To the Lighthouse and stuff like this.
Yes.
And what it is just this. It is the actual flow of thoughts and feelings as they pass over over the writer's consciousness. As the writer thinks and feels, so he or she writes.
But
And this was
without causation, without grammar, often with just dashes connecting
yep.
otherwise disconnected thoughts. Yes.
Yep, flashes of imagery, flashes of memory. It could be anything, and what evokes what, who knows. And to some extent, this is a notion which to some extent sprang from Sigmund Freud.
Yes.
Sigmund Freud had a therapeutic method called automatic writing, whereby he would just get his patient, as part of psychotherapy, to simply write their thoughts and feelings as they were actually sitting there writing their thoughts and feelings and stuff like this. And so he used it as a therapeutic tool. Postmodernism is the great age of Freudian influence on literary studies. I remember when I first, as an undergraduate, when I first heard that we were going to be using some of the theories of the id, the ego, the super ego, stuff like this, in order to interpret certain characters' behaviors and what you like in various works of literature, I was a little bit surprised because his discipline in many ways seemed so disparate. And of course, many of his theories are now debunked and what have you. But it was a thing. I mean, I remember running into professors who were specialists in Freudian analysis of literature. That's kind of their shtick. That's kind of what they did.
Yeah.
But the influence of Freud upon these writers here is everywhere. Very, very significant. And I mentioned another thinker and writer whose influence is considerable at this point in history, and that, of course, is Carl Jung.
Yes.
And
I
so
was
this
just
play
going to
is
go there.
yeah, this play is oftentimes interpreted in Jungian terms, of the great collective subconscious of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But
Yes.
say more about that.
Well, what I would say on that is that it persists and it remains influential. I mean, Jungian archetypes were crucial to our compatriot Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, and are appealed to today in Jordan Peterson's framing of consciousness and so forth, and even his reading of scripture. He sees it in terms of archetypes that are based on Jung's theories here. Jung was a disciple of Freud's, and really, I think, does depend on this binary notion of reality and signification that you spoke of already. So it doesn't really recognize any reality outside of the mind. And so hence the discipline of psychology takes on extraordinary significance, even though the discipline itself did not exist as such before the 20th century. It's an entirely novel discipline, which I always find itself noteworthy. And I do say this to my students. When a new discipline appears, that itself is an interesting fact. What the discipline studies is maybe of interest, but the mere fact that a new discipline emerges is itself worthy of commentary. And why do they emerge at this time, and what does it express? And to my mind, it is this notion of an internalization of reality, and a suggestion, furthermore, that the reality is not in the thought, but rather in the words connecting to the other words, which are, I guess, the best you can do with it is to say they're archetypally significant. And that will connect the words that I'm using in my head with the words you're using in your head. It's the reality is some sort of vague archetypal connection to things. But there's no sense of grounding that in history or meaning or purpose then. It's, again, a very circular worldview, and it's probably not without it's not accidental that Jordan Peterson adheres to evolution again on that front, because it's a very circular view of life and its processes, having no particular meaning, but I guess progressing is the best you could say. I'm not sure that you can draw that conclusion from that worldview. And it's certainly the case that Beckett does not draw that conclusion of progress. On the contrary, entirely the opposite. And there's no need to draw the conclusion that life is meaningful or that it's going in a good place because of this movement, this referentiality in terms of binary oppositions. You can come to the exact opposite conclusion. And in fact, that is the legacy of 20th century thought, is it does conclude that there's nothing there.
Yeah, it's I see this all beginning in the 18th century, and I think
It
it starts
does.
starts
Yes.
very subtly, and it
Starts with
arises in
Rousseau and
things.
yep,
Yes,
and Herder.
And it manifests in things like the rise of the psychological novel and things of
Yes.
that sort, and the romantic turn inward from outer reality to contemplations within the self. It's kind of an internalizing
You might even
disconnect
see it beginning
from
in Descartes
reality.
with it, his cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, right? So the reference to
Yeah,
the thinking self, this, and he calls it a race, a thing, a race cogitans, a thinking thing, a thinking substance. That's how he refers to himself. And he grounds God, he doesn't ground himself on the greatness of God. Rather, God is a postulate that must exist because he exists.
yeah. So God takes on a parasitic status
Well,
in
he's a greater
ontological
being
terms.
than Descartes is, so therefore, but really the ultimate thinking thing is Descartes himself. And later writers will say, and Descartes says that he establishes ontology on the basis of it. And later writers like Nietzsche will say, no, actually, all he establishes is that he's thinking, not that he exists. So his conclusion is unnecessary and has not been proved. I think, therefore I am. No, you think, therefore you're thinking. You haven't actually proven that you are,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
they're correct in that sense. How can you ground that? This is pure assertion. This is a signification that is unnecessary.
Yeah, the connection is arbitrary. Speaking of
And
arbitrary,
arbitrary, yes. And that's, later writers will say exactly that.
I do want to come back to that concept. You were talking about language and the internalization of language and its ability or inability to generate meaning. And I want to talk about what I want to take this down an avenue that these writers and thinkers oftentimes took it down, which is this notion that language and the connection of signs to signified um, is not just arbitrary. It operates by way of a social contract. And so, for instance, if you're reading your Wittgenstein, he's got his black box theory to help explain this. So if I have a black box, and in the black box I say there is a beetle, by that word beetle, you and I have made a kind of a social agreement that it means this insect type thing, it's a particular type of insect and stuff like that. But you and I can renegotiate that in a heartbeat. And that's the nature of not just language, but the thought which drives language. And so you've unmoored your ability to comprehend reality entirely from anything external outside of mind. And this is something that the postmodernists find invigorating. They find it dangerous. They find it edgy. And here we're back to this sort of Gnostic notion that there are only a few who are brave enough to embrace the meaninglessness of thought and language and life, who will actually make these terrible assertions that it's all pointless and it's all not ultimately entropic and nihilistic and things like this. That again is a hallmark of this group. Problem is, this group used to style themselves very much as rebels in binary opposition to mainstream society.
Yeah.
How do they actually? I find this increasingly absurd, to use the word knowingly again here, that these people have now become the mainstream of academia, the mainstream of the entertainment industry, the mainstream of the artistic world, and yet they're still striking rebel poses. And I
Well,
find
there's nothing left to strike because that's their identity per se. Because otherwise, if you live in a dualistic universe and you are the dominant, then you're the oppressor.
Yep.
There can be no other conclusion in the way they've conceived of things. But the truth of the matter is that is the position that they're in. And given that they live in a binary universe, there is no other conclusion than that they are oppressors. And so you will find that exactly that in social justice movements right now, is we have to remove people from positions of power, not because they've actually oppressed anyone, but because they're in positions of power. So therefore they need to be removed. That's the right.
Yeah, good to know. Yeah, and I think this is kind of interesting because, again, we hit another absurdity. We're going to be hitting them everywhere here, which is that the people who are in positions of power are in in the oppressor status, and everyone else is in the oppressed status. We need to remove the people in who have oppressor status and power, and put in the other people, in which case they will become
The same thing.
Hegemonically dominant, and they'll become oppressors themselves, begging the question, why are we trying to remove the people from power? This is an endless cycle of destruction and mayhem and chaos to no
But that
end.
reflects the
There's
worldview being presented there. It is a theory of chaos. It reverts to chaos. It intends chaos. The outcome is chaos. Those who think that they're going to get at the top of the ladder are doomed to a Sisyphus-like existence. You're going to find that boulder rolls back down on you. I realized this, that I studied under a deconstructionist, very fine man, Timothy Clark. But I realized very early on that this worldview, which was everywhere, and you mentioned it when you were studying, same with me in the academy, that this was not for me. This is one of the reasons that Christianity was not only plausible but delightful to me. It had meaning and purpose. It had a sense of being and the importance of being, and also the beauty of being. Again, in these thinkers, there's no reference to goodness, beauty, truth, none of those things. These are things to be undermined, sabotaged. If you look at 20th century art, it expresses that. You mentioned Dadaism. We could go further down that route. There are really terrific exposés of that out there already. What we're saying here is known in the academy already, I think, Bill.
I think so.
But there's no will to seek to present an alternative to it, or at least if there is, then it's so small in its presentation, and it's certainly given no airtime in the academy, and it's resisted because, of course, those are the oppressors, even though they are actually now the marginalized voices. You're still the oppressor.
It speaks perhaps to some extent to the ever-increasing bankruptcy of the humanities. If you study the humanities, to a large extent, this is what you're studying. And your conclusion was that it's all meaningless and pointless. So what, my studies here have been meaningless and pointless? I was throwing thousands of dollars, years of my life, boundless energy, making big sacrifices, only to conclude that everything, including this degree, is meaningless. I can't imagine that being a terribly attractive proposition to a young person coming into the university, coming into the academy.
No,
it certainly wasn't an attractive proposition to me, and I realized this about a year and a half in. Is like this is the main tenor of what I'm getting involved in here, so I need to find a response to that.
Yeah, me too. And you can find an alternate purpose, but it really isn't an alternate purpose then, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And you have to recover something that's no longer being valued or even represented in the academy.
But I was fortunate in my university studies that they taught me early on that if I wanted knowledge, to a large extent, the professors were just facilitators. They were midwives, if you like. The main person who was going to have to do that, gain that knowledge, in this case, the lost knowledge that it wasn't being taught anymore, was going to have to be me. So I got used to taking the initiative very early on. When I saw a gap in my knowledge, they would talk, for instance, somebody would make a tangential reference to this great and important idea in the dialogues of Socrates. I would make a note, go read that dialogue.
So I did exactly the same.
Yep. So, and as I began reading these great writers of the past, they in turn referenced other great thinkers in the great conversation. And this became all of a sudden more reading opportunities than I had time for. It was wonderful and terrible at the same time. But I want to come back to this notion here of beauty. Theodor Adorno, who we've already mentioned, he's one of the
Frankfurt School.
Frankfurt School. He's connected to a lot of people who identify with cultural Marxism and the ideas and the program that has been put in place over there. But I believe it was Adorno, I could be getting this wrong, who said basically that at this point in history, at the dawn of the postmodern era, beauty had been evacuated from the progress of art, as if art itself had some kind of evolutionary trajectory that it was following, and that progressively, according to the dynamics of progressivism, it was getting better and better, and it had just jettisoned its obsession with its need for beauty in any sense. People ask, why is so much modern art ugly? It's just ugly or banal. Why is that? Well, this is a product that arose from the thinking of people like this. I've mentioned Marcel Duchamp. He produced something in 1917 sort of under the geas of Dadaism and surrealism and things like that, where he had absurdist sort of art, and it didn't really catch on initially. And his most famous piece is a urinal, which he tore out of a condemned building, and he sprayed his name across the bottom, and then he auctioned it, and it ended up selling for an enormous amount of money at the time, underscoring the fact that what was art was whatever society arbitrarily deemed was art. And they actually put their money where their mouth was, and they bought this thing. It's called The Fountain, if you want to look it up. And it's a classic piece of absurdist art, but it paves the way for these later thinkers in the postmodern period to get away with saying, that the beauty, if there is beauty in art, the ascription of beauty and the value of beauty is arbitrarily and socially assigned. It's socially constructed. That's all it is. And at the end of the day, really, if you dig down through all the seeming beauty, what you're really finding are the dynamics of hegemonics and logocentrism in this case here, which needs to be overturned. There's that there was an artistic display piece that was going around some time ago, consisting of rotting meat, I think it was, and people said, well, how did we get to this state where people are running around calling this art? Well, this is how people like Adorno and Gramsci and people like this doing their work. That brings me back to another point I want to just mention very briefly, which is that there was a flash of renewed interest in the philosophy of aesthetics in the 20th century, and it's largely now died away. Adorno and people like that kind of.
Yeah, he has a book on aesthetic
Struck the
theory,
last.
and he's
Yeah.
fascinating in music as well. I'm going to get to that, but go ahead.
Yeah. So we no longer really talk about beauty because it's no longer a living concern in the intellectual and artistic world, except accidentally and incidentally. And luckily, there are many happy accidents in the second half of the 20th century. So we still have some good art out there, but it's not something respected and valued as it conventionally is. Where was I going with this? Adorno, evacuation of beauty. Oh yeah. Also, what we encounter with a lot of this thinking, when I'm speaking to young people about this, they will get into the tautologies and the ironies of many of the assertions of postmodernism. What is the purpose of saying everything is purposeless? Is there a purpose to saying everything is purposeless? What is the meaning of saying everything is meaning? Is there any meaning that inheres in saying everything is meaningless? It seems to me like they're out on a philosophical limb and they're sawing, and they're on the wrong end of the limb, because they're getting rid of any ability for their work to be esteemed or even understood. And of course, the classic move on the part of the postmodernist existentialist is to grin madly at this point and nod. And that's as far as you can take them. Anyway, I want to turn back over to you, Scott.
So Adorno wrote the most important work on aesthetics, really, in the probably latter 20th century, at least some would say it that way. You mentioned that he's a cultural Marxist. He also has a theory of music, and his theory of music thinks that music needs to not only break with its current deeply problematic commitment to what he would see probably as capitalist culture, big production quality and so forth. But even with classical music, it has to be a total break with the music of the past. So I believe, and this is not my area of specialism, that he championed a new musical scale. Is this correct? Do you know anything about that, Bill?
That I don't know. I study classical music, but usually my studies kind of peter out right at the beginning of the 20th century.
Oh, well, that's probably wise. But you will note that in the period we start to get atonal music emerging and so forth, and it purposefully moves away from anything that we would recognize as musicality, and tone and harmony. These are things that get dispensed with in favor of, again, a sort of a meandering, apparently, and not particularly beautiful. And times you'll hear sounds that are, quite frankly, jarring and so forth. And there's an experiment with sound, but it isn't connected with music per se, at least not classically defined. So there's an attempt to a wholesale attempt to redefine music in ways that are not fitting with the Western tradition. I don't know enough about this, but it moves away from a mimetic tradition. Mimesis, remember, music is one of the 7 liberal arts. It's seen as a realm of knowledge alongside mathematics, because again, the scale of and the harmonies are directly mathematically derived. You can, and for obvious reasons, people who are musical geniuses are often mathematically very adept as well, because there is a sort of a very strong precision there. Well, come the 20th century with this new type of music, there's a movement away from beauty towards, again, experimentation in sound. But the sound is not supposed to be beautiful. It's just supposed to shock sensibilities, to play with them and to ruin them. I think it's Plato who said that if you want to destroy a culture, you have to change its music.
That sounds about right.
It is right. I know, I think he said it in his laws. It's an extraordinary comment, actually, when you consider what modern music does in terms of what is fashionable one year becomes passé the next, and one generation cannot tolerate the next generation's musical tastes. And that is a perpetuating cycle, so that there's no share. It's not only there's no shared cultural narrative, there's no shared history, there's not even a shared aesthetic sensibility. It's inculcating the
That's right.
chaos and the discord and the fractiousness between generations as if they were binary opposites. You're young, I'm old. I like this, you like that. But you said it was arbitrary. I wanted to say something about that. Arbitrary means it's disconnected from any obvious purpose or meaning. It also is connected with the Latin word arbitrio, will. It's just a will. I like this, but I can't say why I like this. I just like it. It's a willful thing, and it's a will to power, is the thing that Foucault will emphasize, as did Nietzsche to some degree, this will to power. And the will to power is to emancipate ourselves from the control of the past, and in particular, I would say, from God.
Yeah, we should remember here our definitions of culture. Cultures are formed and held together by a shared set of values, and that, of course, expresses itself in many different ways. But one of the most powerful is in art, and one of the most powerful arts to express value, it's of course music. In the postmodern age, we're moving into a strange cultural revolutionary period here, where one generation rejects in revolution the previous generation, and more specifically its values, and even more specifically the values embodied in their art, in their music and things like this. Yes. Here. And so we see this explosion of in the middle and late 1950s of the popularity of rock and roll, and we see that older generations are incensed and shocked and dismayed by the rise of rock and roll and the popularity of rock and roll, and that just sort of seems to throw fuel on the fire here for the young people who are celebrating this revolutionary new music and things of this sort. And nothing could be more corrosive to culture than hating the values of the generation that went before you. And of course, in turn, we ourselves will have our values hated by the generation that follows. A culture like that will not last very long at all. It will splinter and explode. And then we start talking about notions like multiculturalism and what have you. Itself a strangely incoherent notion if you begin to take it apart.
Well, it's coherent in its incoherence. That's its value. We are to appreciate it because we're to appreciate it. There's nothing that's particularly signified by the multiculturalism, I guess, other than we're not going to say that anything is better than anything else, which is itself a statement of the superiority of that to what went before. And it's an expression of nihilism, again, the meaninglessness of every culture. So we're going to express that meaningless of culture by affirming all cultures, which is to deny them all. Because if you say that, right?
Yeah, it's a cultural position on positions of culture.
Yes.
And so in that sense, it's not actually a position on culture, it's a position on positions on culture. So it's like a parasite, a parasitical position. But the problem is we've gotten rid of the host, which was Canadian culture, however conceived. which of course is a blend of many different cultures coming together and finding points of agreement in terms of values and things like this. And this binds us together theoretically with a sense of unity.
Yeah.
Well, whatever that is as a coherent notion is gone. All we're left with is the multicultural parasitic position without a host.
Yes.
It's absurd, but of course we already know that it's absurd.
That's the point. It was the
That's the
theater of
point.
the absurd.
That's right.
Bill, if we talk about this anymore, we're going to start talking about the sign of the signifier, the design, and this and the endless play of signifiers, and that there is no transcendental signifier, and we'll get into all that. But should we stop?
Let's just stop and get off.
Get off this. Get off this Ferris wheel.
Yes.
Next week, what are we doing next week, Bill?
We're going to be looking at the work of William Faulkner.
Yes.
I don't think you and I have settled on a single work of his, or maybe we'll
I thought you had proposed A Rose for Emily.
I don't mind that suggestion. I've taught A Rose for Emily before, a rather haunting tale that moves us in through many of the same sort of realms that we're exploring here, but somewhat more grounded in culture. And the culture specifically uses as a lens the notion of Southern Gothic. So we can talk a little bit about that and things like this. But certainly one of the most significant American authors of the 20th century, Faulkner.
For sure. Okay, well then that should be it for us today. I'm Scott Masson with my esteemed colleague Bill Friesen here with Paideia Today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.
Take care, folks.